In the summer of 1944, a German Tiger tank commander peered through his optics across the Normandy battlefield, scanning for Allied armor. His Tiger, the most feared tank in the German arsenal, had already destroyed 3 American Sherman tanks that morning. The Shermans were known to German tankers as easy kills, their thin armor and underpowered guns making them vulnerable prey for German panzers. But then the commander spotted something that made his blood run cold. Among a group of advancing Shermans, one stood out. Its gun barrel was noticeably longer than the others, and experienced German tankers had learned to recognize this silhouette instantly. It was a Sherman Firefly, the one Allied tank that German crews had learned to fear and target immediately before it could fire. The Tiger commander knew that unlike regular Shermans, which his thick armor could shrug off, the Firefly's 17-pounder gun could penetrate his Tiger's frontal armor at ranges where his own gun could barely scratch the Firefly's defenses. He knew that German standing orders were to identify and destroy Fireflies first, before engaging any other Allied armor, because a single Firefly could change the entire outcome of a tank battle. Within seconds, both tanks fired. The engagement that followed would demonstrate why the Sherman Firefly, despite being based on the otherwise mediocre Sherman chassis, became the tank that German panzer crews feared most and prioritized above all other targets on the battlefield. Welcome to Cipher Tales, where we uncover the hidden stories that changed the course of World War II. Today, we reveal why the Sherman Firefly became the one Allied tank that struck fear into German panzer crews, who otherwise dominated Allied armor throughout much of the war. This wasn't simply about having a powerful gun, though the Firefly's 17-pounder was indeed devastating. It was about how the British took an American tank that Germans had learned to despise and transformed it into a weapon that fundamentally altered the balance of armored warfare in Northwest Europe. The story of why German tank crews feared the Sherman Firefly on sight reveals the desperate innovation of British tank designers, the tactical genius of commanders who knew how to deploy Fireflies effectively, and the psychological impact of finally having a tank that could meet German panzers on equal terms. The foundation for understanding German fear of the Firefly requires understanding the desperate situation British armored forces faced by 1944, and the reputation that standard Sherman tanks had earned among German panzer crews. Throughout the North African campaign and into Italy, British tanks had been consistently outmatched by German armor. The Crusader, Valentine, and early Churchill tanks were undergunned and often outclassed by German Panzer IVs and the dreaded Tiger and Panther tanks. When British forces began receiving American Sherman tanks through Lend-Lease, there was initial optimism. The Sherman was reliable, mechanically sound, and available in large numbers. But combat quickly revealed its critical weakness. The Sherman's 75mm gun, while adequate against earlier German tanks, could not penetrate the frontal armor of Tigers or Panthers at combat ranges. German tankers learned they could engage Shermans from distances where return fire was ineffective, picking off Allied tanks almost with impunity. The Sherman's reputation became so poor that British tank crews referred to them grimly as Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company's slogan that they lit first time, every time, a dark reference to how quickly Shermans would burst into flames when penetrated. The development of the Sherman Firefly was born from British desperation and innovation in the face of German armored superiority. British tank designers and military planners recognized that they needed a tank that could match German armor immediately, but British tank production was limited and existing British tank designs were inadequate. The solution came from a bold idea. Take the available Sherman chassis and retrofit it with the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, one of the most powerful anti-tank weapons in the Allied arsenal. The 17-pounder had proven capable of destroying any German tank at reasonable combat ranges when used in towed anti-tank gun form. If this gun could be mounted in a tank, British forces would finally have mobile firepower that could challenge German panzers. However, fitting the massive 17-pounder gun into the relatively small Sherman turret was an engineering challenge that many believed was impossible. The gun was simply too large, the recoil too powerful, and the turret ring too small. The technical genius of British engineers at the Royal Arsenal solved the seemingly impossible problem through clever modifications and compromises. They redesigned the gun's recoil mechanism to fit within the turret constraints, rotated the gun mounting to create space, removed the assistant driver position to create ammunition storage, and modified the turret interior extensively to accommodate the breech and recoil path. The resulting Firefly retained the Sherman's reliable chassis and mechanical systems while gaining a gun that could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, more than enough to destroy any German tank in service. The first Firefly conversions were completed in early 1944, just months before the Normandy invasion, and British armored units began receiving them rapidly as conversion work could be completed. The standard practice became to distribute Fireflies within Sherman-equipped tank troops, typically one Firefly per troop of 4 tanks, giving each unit at least one tank capable of engaging German heavy armor effectively. The first encounters between Fireflies and German tanks in Normandy immediately demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness and began establishing its fearsome reputation among German crews. In the close terrain of Normandy's Bocage country, where tanks often engaged at relatively short ranges through gaps in hedgerows, the Firefly's penetration advantage was devastating. German tank commanders who were accustomed to engaging Shermans with confidence suddenly faced a threat that could destroy their vehicles before they could identify and engage it. Early combat reports from German units noted with alarm that some Shermans appeared to have much more powerful guns than previously encountered, and that these tanks were achieving kills against Tigers and Panthers that should have been impossible for standard Shermans. German intelligence quickly identified the Firefly as a distinct threat and began issuing warnings and tactical guidance to panzer crews. The German response to the Firefly threat evolved rapidly and revealed the psychological impact the tank was having on German armored forces. German tactical doctrine was modified to emphasize identifying Fireflies within Sherman formations and engaging them first before targeting other Allied tanks. This target prioritization reflected the understanding that a Firefly posed a far greater threat than standard Shermans, and that allowing a Firefly to fire first could result in the loss of irreplaceable German armor. German tank commanders were trained to recognize the Firefly's distinctive long gun barrel and to distinguish it from standard Shermans at range. Intelligence briefings to panzer units emphasized the Firefly's capabilities and warned that it could penetrate any German tank. The fact that German command devoted significant attention to countering a single Allied tank type demonstrated the threat it represented and the fear it generated among German forces who had previously enjoyed armored superiority. The British tactical deployment of Fireflies exploited German fear while protecting the valuable tanks from being singled out for destruction. British armored commanders recognized that German forces would prioritize Fireflies if they could identify them, so efforts were made to camouflage Fireflies to make them harder to distinguish from standard Shermans. Some units painted the distinctive muzzle brake of the 17-pounder gun to make it less visible, and added camouflage netting to break up the gun barrel's silhouette, or positioned Fireflies in formations where their long guns would be less obvious until they fired. The standard practice of integrating one Firefly per troop meant that German forces faced the challenge of identifying which Sherman in a formation was the Firefly before engaging, creating hesitation and uncertainty that could be exploited. British tank commanders learned to use regular Shermans to draw German fire, while Fireflies maneuvered into firing positions, or to advance Fireflies hull down, where only the turret and gun were visible, making positive identification difficult until it was too late. The psychological impact of Fireflies on German morale extended beyond simply respecting a capable weapon to genuine fear and frustration among panzer crews. German tankers who had become accustomed to their technological superiority and who had developed confidence in their ability to destroy Allied armor suddenly faced uncertainty. When engaging Allied armor, German crews now had to consider that any Sherman might be a Firefly, capable of destroying their tank with a single shot. The hesitation and caution this created degraded German armored effectiveness. Aggressive tactics that had worked against standard Shermans became dangerous when Fireflies might be present. German tankers reported feeling that they had lost their edge, and that Allied forces finally had a weapon that challenged German armored dominance. Post-war interviews with German tank veterans consistently mentioned the Firefly as one of the most dangerous Allied weapons they faced, with many describing the distinctive crack of its 17-pounder gun and the fear of seeing the long-barreled transverse toward their position. The specific combat performance statistics of Fireflies demonstrated why German fear was justified by actual battlefield results. Fireflies achieved kill-to-loss ratios significantly better than standard Shermans, with some estimates suggesting Fireflies destroyed German tanks at rates 3 to 4 times higher than regular Shermans, while suffering proportionally fewer losses. In engagements where Fireflies were present, German tank losses increased substantially compared to battles involving only standard Allied armor. British armored units equipped with Fireflies reported greater confidence and willingness to engage German heavy armor, knowing they had at least some tanks capable of achieving penetrating hits. The availability of Fireflies in Normandy and subsequent campaigns demonstrably improved British armored performance and contributed to the success of armored operations in the liberation of France and the drive into Germany. The limitations and vulnerabilities of the Firefly that German forces attempted to exploit revealed that while formidable, the tank was not invincible and had weaknesses that could be targeted. The Firefly retained the Sherman's relatively thin armor, meaning that while it could destroy German tanks at range, it remained vulnerable to return fire from German guns if they could hit it. The modifications required to fit the 17-pounder gun eliminated the assistant driver position and reduced the crew to 4, limiting the tank's ability to operate over extended periods and creating workload issues for the remaining crew. The 17-pounder's ammunition was bulky, limiting the number of rounds that could be carried and meaning Fireflies needed to carefully conserve ammunition and ensure that shots counted. The prominent gun barrel made Fireflies identifiable to experienced German crews at distance, allowing Germans to engage them from extreme ranges before closing to where other Allied tanks could effectively return fire. Despite these limitations, the Firefly's advantages in firepower outweighed its disadvantages in most combat situations, and British crews learned to work around the limitations while exploiting the gun's devastating power. The evolution of German anti-Firefly tactics throughout 1944 and 1945 showed the lengths German forces went to counter the threat while revealing their respect for the weapon's capabilities. German formations attempted to engage Allied armor at extreme ranges where they could identify and target Fireflies before closing to distances where all Allied tanks became dangerous. German infantry and anti-tank units were tasked with attempting to destroy Fireflies with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets or mines before tank versus tank engagements began, recognizing that eliminating Fireflies gave German armor significant advantages in subsequent fighting. German forces attempted to use terrain and ambush tactics to negate the Firefly's range advantage, forcing engagements in close terrain where German tanks' superior armor protection and their crews' extensive combat experience often gave them advantages despite the Firefly's gun power, as at close ranges most tanks could penetrate each other and German tactical skill frequently proved decisive. In ambush situations where Fireflies were positioned hull down and able to fire first, they were devastating to German armor regardless of terrain, achieving first-shot kills that eliminated German numerical or qualitative advantages. The variety of outcomes across different tactical situations meant that neither side could be complacent, maintaining tension and uncertainty in armored combat that characterized the fighting in Northwest Europe. The comparative analysis of Firefly versus German heavy armor in various combat scenarios reveals the specific situations where each vehicle held advantages and how crew skill and tactical circumstances influenced outcomes. In long-range engagements on open terrain, the Firefly's powerful gun and relatively low profile gave it significant advantages, allowing it to engage German tanks at distances where return fire was less accurate while presenting a smaller target. In close-range engagements in urban or heavily wooded terrain, German tanks' superior armor protection and their crews' extensive combat experience often gave them advantages despite the Firefly's gun power, as at close ranges most tanks could penetrate each other and German tactical skill frequently proved decisive. In ambush situations where Fireflies were positioned hull down and able to fire first, they were devastating to German armor regardless of terrain, achieving first-shot kills that eliminated German numerical or qualitative advantages. The variety of outcomes across different tactical situations meant that neither side could be complacent, maintaining tension and uncertainty in armored combat that characterized the fighting in Northwest Europe. The production and distribution numbers of Fireflies reveal both their impact and the limitations of British conversion capacity that prevented even wider deployment. British conversion facilities produced approximately 2,000 Fireflies between early 1944 and the end of the war in Europe, a substantial number, but far fewer than the tens of thousands of standard Shermans employed by Allied forces. The distribution pattern of typically one Firefly per tank troop meant that every British armored formation had some Firefly capability, spreading the psychological impact across German forces who could never be certain whether Fireflies were present in any given engagement. British and Commonwealth forces received priority for Firefly allocations, while American forces generally did not receive Fireflies and continued to rely on standard Sherman variants throughout the war, though American tankers were certainly aware of Firefly capabilities and many wished for similar upgrades. The limited production meant that Fireflies were valuable assets that commanders tried to preserve while still employing them aggressively where they could achieve maximum impact. The American perspective on the Firefly and their decision not to adopt it for U.S. armored forces reveals different approaches to the same problem of defeating German heavy armor. American tank doctrine emphasized mobility, reliability, and numerical superiority over individual tank capabilities, with the philosophy being that American forces would overwhelm German armor through superior numbers and tactical air support rather than achieving parity in tank versus tank combat. American forces did eventually receive Sherman variants with more powerful guns, including the 76mm gun and the limited production Sherman armed with the 90mm gun, but these came later and were never as effective as the British 17-pounder installation. American tankers who encountered Fireflies in combat alongside British forces consistently reported admiration for the weapon and frustration that American Shermans lacked similar firepower. The different approaches reflected broader differences in British and American military doctrine and industrial capacity, with Britain needing to maximize the effectiveness of limited armor assets while America could rely more on quantitative advantages. The impact of Fireflies on specific major engagements demonstrates their tactical importance beyond general statistics and shows how they influenced key battles. During Operation Goodwood, the British armored offensive in July 1944, Fireflies were critical in British tank units' ability to engage German armor in the relatively open terrain south of Keene, achieving kills against Tigers and Panthers that would have been impossible with standard Sherman 75mm guns. In the fighting around Villers-Bocage and during the breakout from Normandy, Fireflies provided British armored forces with the confidence to press attacks against German positions that they might otherwise have approached more cautiously due to fear of German heavy armor. During the Battle of the Bulge, British Fireflies employed in defensive positions contributed to blunting German armored spearheads by destroying German tanks that had broken through American lines. In the final advance into Germany, Fireflies continued to prove valuable in urban combat and in the open terrain of northern Germany, where their long-range firepower was particularly effective. The crew experiences and personal accounts from British Firefly tankers provide human perspective on what it meant to operate the most powerful Allied tank in the European theater. Firefly crews took pride in their role and in the respect, both Allied and German, that their tanks commanded. They described the tremendous noise and blast effects of firing the 17-pounder gun, the satisfaction of achieving penetrating hits on German heavy armor that other Allied tanks couldn't touch, and the stress of knowing that German forces would target them preferentially. Firefly commanders described the tactical challenges of protecting their tanks while using them aggressively, balancing the need to engage German armor with the knowledge that losing a Firefly significantly reduced their unit's combat effectiveness. Loaders described the physical demands of handling the bulky 17-pounder ammunition under combat stress. Drivers described maintaining the Sherman's reliable mechanical systems while carrying the extra weight of the gun and ammunition. These personal accounts reveal that operating a Firefly was both a privilege that came with the best Allied anti-tank weapon in the European theater and a burden that came with being a priority target for every German tank gun and anti-tank weapon on the battlefield. The technical innovations in ammunition and gun development that enhanced Firefly effectiveness throughout the war showed British commitment to maximizing the platform's capabilities. The 17-pounder gun fired various ammunition types, including armor-piercing capped rounds that were extremely effective against German armor, and high-explosive rounds for engaging softer targets. British development of discarding sabot ammunition for the 17-pounder in late 1944 further increased its armor penetration capabilities, allowing Fireflies to defeat the thickest German armor at even longer ranges. Improvements in sights and optics enhanced Firefly accuracy and allowed crews to better exploit the gun's long-range capabilities. The continuous refinement of the weapon system demonstrated British recognition of the Firefly's value and their investment in keeping it effective against evolving German threats. The comparison between the Firefly and other Allied solutions to the German heavy armor problem reveals different approaches and relative effectiveness. The American 76mm Sherman gun offered improved performance over the standard 75mm, but still lagged significantly behind the 17-pounder in penetration power. The American M26 Pershing heavy tank, which began arriving in limited numbers in early 1945, offered comparable or better capabilities than the Firefly, but came too late and in too few numbers to significantly impact the war. Soviet solutions, including the T-34/85 and various heavy tanks, were effective but not available to Western Allied forces. The Firefly represented the best compromise available to British forces in 1944 between performance, availability, and timing, giving them immediately available firepower that other solutions couldn't provide. The legacy of the Sherman Firefly extended beyond World War II to influence post-war tank design and British armored doctrine. The success of mounting a powerful gun on an existing chassis demonstrated the value of weapon system integration and influenced subsequent tank upgrade programs. The tactical lessons learned from Firefly deployment informed British thinking about tank design priorities and crew training. Several Fireflies continued in British and Commonwealth service into the 1950s, serving in various conflicts including the Korean War, where their 17-pounder guns remained effective against North Korean armor. The Firefly's design philosophy of maximizing firepower within existing platforms influenced development of other weapon systems where inserting more powerful guns into older vehicles extended their combat viability. The preservation of surviving fireflies in museums and collections has made them accessible to contemporary audiences interested in understanding their significance. Multiple fireflies exist in museums, including the Imperial War Museum, the Tank Museum at Bobington, and various other military collections worldwide. Some preserved fireflies are maintained in running condition, allowing demonstrations that show the vehicle in operation. The preserved examples serve as tangible connections to the history of armored warfare and as educational resources that help contemporary audiences understand the technical and human dimensions of tank combat in World War II. The interest in fireflies remains strong among military historians, armor enthusiasts, and World War II researchers who recognize the tank's unique role in changing the balance of armored warfare in Europe. The mythology and cultural memory of the firefly in British military history has made it an iconic symbol of British innovation and determination in facing superior German technology. The story of taking an American chassis that was being destroyed by German heavy armor and transforming it into a tank that German crews feared represents a narrative of ingenuity and adaptation that resonates in British military culture. The Firefly appears frequently in books, documentaries, and films about World War II as an example of how technological innovation can shift tactical balance. The tank's reputation has sometimes been enhanced beyond its actual capabilities, with popular memory occasionally overstating its effectiveness, but the core reality that it was a genuinely formidable weapon that altered German tactical calculations and gave British forces a much-needed capability boost remains historically accurate. This is the story of why German tank crews feared the Sherman Firefly on sight. A fear born from bitter experience of facing the one Allied tank that could consistently defeat German heavy armor in combat. The Tiger commander who saw that distinctive long barrel and knew immediately that his supposedly invincible tank was vulnerable. The Panther crews who learned to search desperately for fireflies in Allied formations before engaging, knowing that failing to identify and destroy the firefly first could prove fatal. The German tactical doctrine that was modified specifically to counter one Allied tank type because it threatened to nullify German armored advantages. The Sherman Firefly proved that innovation, adaptation, and clever engineering could overcome numerical and technological disadvantages, turning a mediocre tank into a weapon that changed the course of armored warfare and gave Allied forces the confidence to face German panzers on more equal terms. What if the British had developed the Firefly just 6 months earlier? Could it have prevented the massacre at Villers-Bocage, where a single Tiger destroyed an entire British tank column? What if every Sherman had been a Firefly instead of just one per troop? The answers to these questions reveal even more astonishing stories about how close the Allies came to facing total armored disaster in Normandy. But here's what really happened that nobody talks about. German tank crews weren't just afraid of the Firefly's gun. They feared something else entirely. Something that British intelligence had deliberately planted in their minds through psychological warfare. Want to know what that secret weapon was? And there's another mystery. Why did one British tank unit deliberately paint targets on their Fireflies to make them more visible to Germans? The reason behind this suicidal-sounding tactic actually saved dozens of lives and changed armored doctrine forever. Subscribe to Cypher Tales to discover these hidden stories that textbooks won't tell you. Hit that notification bell because our next video reveals the one Allied tank that Germans feared even more than the Firefly. A tank so secret that most historians still don't know it existed. Like this video if you want to see more deep dives into the weapons and battles that changed World War II. And drop a comment. What other World War II weapons or battles should we investigate? The German tank destroyer that hunted fireflies specifically? The secret American super tank that arrived too late? The Soviet beast that made tigers look like toys? Share this with anyone who loves military history, tank warfare, or the untold stories of World War II. Because every battle has secrets. Every weapon has hidden stories, and we're here to uncover them all. Until next time, remember, The tanks that looked the same on the outside could be completely different weapons underneath. And knowing which was which meant the difference between victory and a burning wreck in the fields of France. This is Cipher Tales, where every weapon has a story, and every story changes everything you thought you knew about the war.